You're listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in 1 Kings 4, Solomon's Wisdom and Prosperous Kingdom. By the time we reach 1 Kings 4, Solomon's kingdom is firmly established. The threats surrounding his ascension to the throne have been dealt with. God has granted his request for wisdom, and Solomon is now governing a prosperous and expanding nation. The chapter gives us a picture of a beautiful season in Israel's history when they were experiencing remarkable peace, prosperity, and order under a wise king. The chapter begins by describing the organization of Solomon's government. We're introduced to priests and secretaries and military leaders, and then administrators and other officials who helped oversee the kingdom. Solomon also divided the nation into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for supplying provisions for the king and his household for 1 month each year. This organization reveals something important about Solomon's wisdom. Wisdom isn't just the ability to understand difficult ideas or give clever answers. Biblical wisdom also involves knowing how to order responsibilities and delegate authority and often govern effectively. Solomon's wisdom affected the practical administration of the kingdom, and the results were remarkable. In verse 20, we read this: Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. This description deliberately reminds us of God's promises to Abraham. God promised Abraham that his descendants would become exceedingly numerous. Well, generations later, during Solomon's reign, we see a significant fulfillment of that promise. Israel had become a large and prosperous nation. Solomon's influence also extended beyond Israel's borders. In verse 21, we read, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. The kingdom had reached an extraordinary point in its history. Solomon possessed wealth, influence, military strength, and international recognition. The chapter describes enormous quantities of food required each day to support his household and his administration, and it also mentions thousands of horses and chariots, which illustrates the tremendous resources that were genuinely available to Solomon at the time. It could also be said that perhaps the most beautiful description of Solomon's reign appears in verse 25. In that verse it says this, And Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. Now the phrase, under his vine and under his fig tree, it paints a picture of security and contentment. People weren't constantly fleeing invading armies or wondering whether enemies would destroy their homes. They could cultivate their land, they could enjoy its fruit, they could raise their families, and then live without constant fear. But the chapter doesn't only emphasize Solomon's wealth. It returns to the gift God had given him in the previous chapter. In verse 29, we read this, And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. Now notice where Solomon's wisdom came from. God gave it to him. Solomon's reputation wasn't ultimately the product of natural intelligence or personal achievement. His extraordinary ability was a gift of divine grace. Solomon had become known internationally for his wisdom. He composed thousands of proverbs and songs and demonstrated remarkable knowledge of plants and animals and birds and reptiles and fish, and people traveled from surrounding nations just to hear him speak. Verse 34 says, And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. This is where the chapter begins pointing us beyond Solomon to Jesus. Solomon was a wise king who attracted people from the nations, but Jesus is the greater king whose wisdom surpasses Solomon's. Jesus made this comparison himself when he said this in Matthew 12:42. He said, "Behold, something greater than Solomon is here." Solomon received wisdom from God, but Jesus is the wisdom of God. The New Testament describes Christ as the power of God and the wisdom of God. We see that in 1 Corinthians 1:24. Solomon could explain God's created world, but Jesus is the one through whom that world was created. Solomon spoke thousands of wise sayings, but Jesus speaks the very words of eternal life. The peace of Solomon's kingdom also anticipates something greater. Under Solomon, Israel experienced a season when people could sit beneath their vines and fig trees without fear. But that peace was temporary. Solomon would eventually die, the kingdom would divide, and Israel would experience war, invasion, exile, and suffering. Well, Jesus offers a kingdom whose peace won't eventually collapse. The prophets anticipated a coming ruler whose kingdom would bring lasting peace. The prophet Isaiah called him the Prince of Peace, and in Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7, he declared that of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. Solomon's kingdom gives us a glimpse of what righteous kingship can produce, but Jesus brings its perfect fulfillment. Where Solomon's wisdom had limits, Christ's wisdom is infinite. Where Solomon's peace was temporary, Christ's peace is everlasting. And where Solomon ruled a particular territory, Jesus possesses authority over every nation. Now, there's another beautiful connection in the people who came from distant lands to hear Solomon. The nations recognized that unusual wisdom had been given to Israel's king, so they traveled to hear him. Well, in Jesus, the greater Son of David has come, and the invitation now goes outward to every nation. People from every tribe, every language, every people group, and nation, they're all being gathered into his kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 4 captures one of the high points of Israel's history. God's promises were being fulfilled. The nation was numerous. The kingdom was prosperous. The people enjoyed peace. Their king possessed extraordinary wisdom, and the nations were drawn to hear him. And yet Solomon wasn't the final king. The blessings of his reign were real, but they were temporary previews of something greater. Jesus is the wiser king, the righteous king, the universal king, and the everlasting king. Solomon's kingdom eventually disappeared, but Christ's kingdom never will. And those who belong to Jesus can look forward to something even better than Israel experienced under Solomon. We can look forward to life forever under the perfect rule of a king whose wisdom never fails, whose justice is never corrupted, and whose peace will never end. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.